I'm really pleased that you can join us today either in this live version of our competency-based education webinar, or perhaps you're viewing this in the recorded archive version. However you're viewing it, we're thrilled that you're with us, because this is a topic that we're all wanting to have become a bigger part of Michigan conversation, and the way to do that is to kind of educate. And I wanted to let you know right away that we are recording this, so that those of you who are on or come on later, you will see on your screen that it's being recorded. We'd like you to know that if you're participating with us. And just to kind of let you know who's kind of leading the show here, I am, Marcia Myers, and EdTech Specialist, and Lisa Sitkins with EdTech Specialists is also on with us, and we're kind of facilitating these webinars. We were going to just call them the summer series, and it became very clear that we needed to extend it. It's still a summer series, but it's going to go through October. So maybe what that means is that the summer series will mean that we'll have summer till the end of October. Since we haven't had much spring, maybe that's the way that will go. That would be nice. We want to thank our sponsors, because they're the ones who are really supporting these. And of course, one of them is EdTech Specialists, and we're really proud to be a sponsor for it. We also have the support from ThinkSpace, which is a new conference center in Lansing, and I would encourage you to, take a look at them. We also have My Virtual Academy and Virtual, and we are pleased that they are helping to encourage and support these conversations. The format for today is going to be that once I introduce our presenter this morning, we will, look for you to, we're going to mute people who are on, but we're going to look for you guys to enter questions into chat, and either our presenter or Lisa will be able to kind of step in and answer them if they're kind of time sensitive, if you will, according to the slide that Ephraim is on, or we'll do those at the end. But Ephraim is really looking forward to having an interactive conversation here. So feel free to jump in at any time, and if you would like to have a conversation like, verbally other than through the chat, just write that into the chat and we'll open up your microphone. And we can do that at any stage. Lisa and I will both be monitoring that and making sure that those opportunities that you're requesting can be made. So I am now going to give a real brief intro to Ephraim and then hand the ball over. And as I told him, I actually have a question to ask him before I really kind of pass the total baton over to his presentation. But Ephraim, I was thinking, Ephraim, I don't remember how you and I were introduced to connected to one another. It may have been through Chris Sturgis and Susan Patrick, but it's really been nice to be able to have the opportunity to connect with you periodically. And as I was kind of reviewing a lot of the things that you've done over the years, it's become very clear that you've been a real centerpiece in conversation and implementation in competency-based education through a lot of your initiatives with, Diploma Plus, which is, one of the things like you've indicated is kind of you're somewhat known for in the big arena of competency-based education and Schools for the Future, and a lot of the initiatives that you're currently working on. You certainly have been a part of a lot of the forum conversations, not only your own in competency works, but as references. So, it's really nice that you've had that role. And so I'm going to introduce you just one second, but I think I'm going to pass the baton over with that question I asked you a little bit ago, because when I was reading back and asked you this morning about kind of how long you've been involved in this, you said since about 1985. And as a former math teacher, which you are as well, I thought, well, that's a long time. So, and as you and I said this morning, that's like good news and bad news. But my question to you this morning, the response was so very encouraging that I do want to ask it again, because if this has been a piece of conversation for 30 years, with ebbs and flows in those conversations, where do you see us right now? Is this a stronger push right now, or how do you view the role that competency-based education might have for our students as we move forward. So, Lisa, if you want to give him the presenter tool, it's my pleasure to introduce Ephraim Weisstein, and looking forward to hearing what you have to share with us.
Thank you, Marcia. So let me put this up in full view. Slideshow from the beginning. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yeah, looks good.
Great, great. Okay, so let me start off by giving a Clip Note version answer to the question that Marcia had asked, which is, what, if anything, has changed in the field of competency-based education? And the quick answer is everything. When I first started, when I was introduced to this back in '85, and I would say up until as recently as 2010, which is a pretty big stretch, competency-based education was very much still an outlier and was seen by many as something which was in the world of alternative education, or certainly non-traditional education. And now, for lots of reasons that we maybe will get into later, it's really moved into the mainstream. So, for example, and I would say that when I refer to competency-based education, I would also include the term personalization, which has become big as well, that a lot of districts around the country are either now experimenting with it, doing it at some level of implementation, or thinking about it. So I would say that the field has flipped to a very, very significant degree, and we can talk later about why. So with that said, let me just kind of jump into it. And again, I do want to really emphasize what Marcia had said before, which is this is meant to be very informal. So questions at any point, and you can do that by the chat, or you can even unmute your line if you'd like to and just kind of jump in, but I'll be monitoring the chat as we move forward. So with that said, let me start with a working definition of CBE, which you can see on the screen. And I do want to kind of emphasize that today what I'm hoping to do is to really have a discussion about the practicality of doing this, whether you're thinking about doing it, already have started, or at some level of experimentation. This would really be all about what are the implementation challenges, rather than spending too much time on definitions. The definitions that I'll throw out are really so that we can have a discussion. So they're working definitions as opposed to getting too deeply into the differences. Let me tackle right off, though, one of the questions which was thrown out, the difference between mastery, proficiency, and competency-based education. For the purposes of this discussion, let's just say that they're the same. There are some differences between them, but I don't think that that's why I'm here today or the focus of this discussion. There is a difference between personalization and competency-based education, which I will get into as we proceed. So anyway, for CBE, which again would cover for our purposes mastery or proficiency-based education, the idea here is pretty simple. Students move forward based on what they've mastered rather than how much time they spend in seats. So what this really blows up potentially in the traditional system is the whole time in seat concept, or Carnegie units as we've known it. So that's a pretty radical departure. So let's get a little deeper into it and look at a couple of the sub-elements of CBE. So first of all, this whole idea of flexible pace, which really is critical in two different ways. On one hand, it means that you don't move on just by getting by, just by passing. So D's or even C's is not a measure of mastery or competency. So you have to reach the benchmark, which is considered to be mastery, however that is defined. It also means that there is no failure, which is important in competency-based, because if you are not yet competent, or proficient, you're just not yet, with yet being the key term, and it means you just continue to work on it. The second bullet, mastery, is driven by real-time data and assessment. It forces you in a competency-based system to know where students are at any given time, unlike in a more traditional classroom where, to a certain degree, the professor or the teacher doesn't worry about it as much because at the end of the day, they're going to give an end-of-the-year exam or some other big exams which will roll up into the grade. And that will tell the professor or the instructor whether the student has passed or not. It's different here. Students move forward every day based on what they know and are demonstrating, and therefore you have to have the data. And the last on the bottom, which we will get into a lot more, is this whole issue of standards and competencies. Are they the same? Are they different? The quick answer, they're not the same, and they're very different. And just like a quick peek into that is that a standard generally is lots of different items. It tends to be about a lot of content, what people know or should know. Competencies tend to be much bigger ideas, much fewer, and often are with higher order thinking skills. But more about that to follow. So let me see if we have anything here in the chat. I don't see anything, so I'm just going to keep going on, but stop me at any point. So, understanding the definition of CBE. A couple of different here. Is it a standard? Well, I kind of gave that one away, or something else. It's something else. It is a part of the system, but a standard-driven program is not in and of itself a competency-based program. Do the competencies vary or stay constant as students move through the school? Let's leave that one hanging for later on because it is kind of key. Can it be content, or is it more like a big idea? The latter. In my opinion, and in the opinion of some others, many others I would say, competencies are fairly large in terms of the kind of the grain size of it. There's not a lot of them, and it is a big idea or a theme which is cross-cutting. Continuing. How students advance is also a huge, huge part of this, and a couple of questions here to consider. There's no exact answer for this, but since we know that students do need to be able to advance based on what they know, there is a question of implementation here, which is anytime. Do you have 150 students all at different paces in any given day or week? What's the criteria for advancement? Is it testing out on a something of a traditional test? Is it a project? Is it a portfolio? Is it all of those things? Is there any limit on how fast the student can do this? So in many states and locales, students have a certain trajectory which is mandated, and you can't move too much faster than that limit. But under a competency-based program, it's theoretically possible that someone could earn all of their high school credits in 2 years. So that's something to consider as well. And how are students organized in their learning? Is this individualized, where everyone is by their own computer or doing individual work? Are students grouped? And lastly, how are assessments handled, and how is the data managed? So I'm continuing to look at the chat, and until I hear other questions, I'm just going to go on for a second until we get to this, which is more of our formal chat. So I have thrown out a lot of ideas quickly about competencies, and one is that they're pretty big ideas, they're big themes, it has something to do with critical thinking, and that it's different than standards. But I would just like to now pause for a second and have a little bit of a kind of back and forth. So if you would, in the chat box, just write down a couple of thoughts that you have as to when you think about a competency. And I'm seeing Mike Murray is asking the question, or saying it's the ability to work with others, one of the big ideas. So that's a great thought. And the quick answer, I would say, in my opinion, is yes, that some folks would call this a 21st century skill. Others might call it a social emotional skill, the ability to work with others. But yes, that could definitely be a competency, and I would say that it's pretty often you would find in a program like a Diploma Plus, Schools for the Future, Big Picture Company, other competency-based programs, that this would be one. So thank you, Mike. That's a great point. Any other thoughts about what might constitute a competency or a big idea? And I think I saw that Jan just joined us, so welcome, Jan. It strikes me that assessment must also be individualized. It strikes me that assessment must also be individualized, and I would say that that is, in fact, the case, that basically, if you're talking about a competency-based approach, then there must be a way of kind of matching what individuals are trying to do with the individual feedback on how they're advancing. So not only individualized work, but obviously individualized assessment and then individualized discussions and feedback to the students in terms of how they're doing. So let's move on now.
Ephraim, can I jump in with a question? I was going to type it in, and I thought, no, I'm going to just jump in. So as I learn more and talk with people, in, for instance, in New Hampshire and various other CBE network models out there, it seems to me that because you're defining competency a little bit differently as I've been learning, it is a big picture kind of thing. What does it look like? And I guess let me ask you, or let me kind of explain what I mean by that. In other words, can a true competency model exist in a traditional school setting where courses are taught in isolation and separately, or does it always find itself transitioning over to kind of a project-based learning model, or I don't even know if it has project-based learning, but something that isn't course-driven but has a different delivery altogether?
Yeah, that's a great point. I would say that, going back to the definition, and the two key points would be mastery, the demonstration of mastery, and the flexibility of time. If you have both of those operational, it doesn't have to be project-based learning. It could certainly be, a course which is taught by an instructor, and a lot of the material can be delivered to the entire class, I would say, as long as students then also have the ability to move on individually and to demonstrate mastery. It's more difficult that way, I think, for some obvious reasons, but I'm saying about competency-based education that implies that it has to be project-based learning or even necessarily individualized learning. It could certainly be small groups working together, and it could probably be the whole class working together for a good amount of the time.
So with that in mind, I guess part of my question too is when I look at like the extended learning options that they've got out in New Hampshire, and obviously they're probably not all doing those kinds of delivery models, but I guess what I'm saying is that where competency offers over time, or are there long-term competency models that kind of still retain that more traditional delivery?
Well, this gets down to the whole question of the continuum of competency-based education. So, at its kind of minimum, at its core, it's the answer that I provided in terms of it's simply mastery and flexibility of time. But it does imply, for example, what you just said, extended learning, because if time is flexible, then there's the concept of anywhere, anytime, anyhow learning, including learning which happens outside of the building and outside of the traditional hours. So that is implied. And then you also have the application, which gets into personalized learning, I would say, and project-based learning, that competency-based education works best where students have a lot of voice and choice, which gets into less of a, here's the curriculum that everyone's going to learn, and it's the same for everyone, to a lot of differences, which includes certainly the option of project-based learning.
Thank you.
Okay, so let's move on now, and I think that these are great points, and we'll kind of drill down a little bit more. So here's an example. This is from Diploma Plus, and let's look at the definition on the top. So first of all, the phrase that I'm seeing over here would be critical thinking skills as they develop knowledge across different content standards. So let's just kind of let that sink in for a second. So we have the interaction here of content standards, which I think people are familiar with if we're talking about math or ELA or science. Everyone is pretty familiar with, whether you're in Michigan or the Common Core state standards, that there is a pretty large chunk of knowledge about any given subject that folks, to a certain degree, agree needs to. But where competencies come in is that they are critical thinking skills that are applied against that content standards. So there is the critical difference between a program which is standards-driven versus a program which is competency-driven, which is a way to, in fact, deal with the standards. Here are two examples from Diploma Plus. And if you look at both of those, I think you can see, hopefully, that these are kind of big ideas. So for math, communicate mathematical ideas using various tools. You could do that for a simple problem like, if the sales tax is 5% and an item costs $100, how much do you pay? To something being much more complex, like a quadratic equation or some geometric problem. Same thing for ELA. Idea development, discuss and support specific evidence. Well, that can be evidence which is for a very simple fourth grade reading material, or it could be something which is nonfiction biology, which is fairly complex. So again, the idea that competencies can be applied across the same competency across different contents and content that becomes more and more complex over time. So that's very, very, I'm looking now at the chat, how are the mathematical practice standards from Common Core different from competencies? Yeah, well, that's a great question. And essentially, I think, in my opinion, what the Common Core has done is it's kind of collapsed together to a certain degree the idea of content standards with more competency-like or big thematic ideas. So in the world of Common Core, there is a mixture of content and competency, whereas in the world of state standards like the Michigan standards, traditionally, there was much more just content-like standards. So the Common Core does kind of mix them together to a certain degree. And let me see if there are any other questions up here. So let me ask Suzette. Suzette, does that answer your question, or is there a follow-up that you'd like to have connected to the Common Core? Okay, I think Suzette is, yes, got it. And Jan is asking, will that also be true the SSS? And I'm embarrassed to say that I don't know what that acronym stands for. So what is NGSSS?
That would be the science standards, Jan?
Yes, right.
Yeah, and I would say that, and these are all, this is a great question. Each discipline, as you know, is somewhat different. So certainly math is very different than ELA, and science, the national science standards are also different in their own way. And I would say that the science standards, to a larger degree, have kind of led the way in the country in recent years in terms of really emphasizing, and I think math has also, that learning science is much more than just kind of a whole set of itty-bitty pieces of knowledge. In fact, the scientific method and a lot of the ways of thinking scientifically really cut to the heart of competencies, or certainly combine standards with the idea of competencies in the sense that it's about big ideas. So that's a great point as well. And it does bring up this whole issue that when you're dealing with the 4 disciplines, there needs to be an understanding that all of them are not the same. But with that said, the idea of the interaction of content with big ideas is still the key here. So let me go on, and thanks for these chats. Let's keep this going, because I think the chats are really, really helpful. So going to the next screen. Typically, and this goes back to what Mike said before, competencies would also include things that are not as strictly kind of academic, quote unquote. And I say that carefully because there is a whole growing movement in this country to say that we don't want to be talking about competencies that live in this 21st century world as academic versus non-academic. So I would not say that these youth development competencies here are in any way non-academic, because if you look at, for example, number 5, problem solver, problem solving is huge in science, it's huge in math, it's huge in all of the disciplines. Now you can also apply that to youth development or more 21st century skills, but the point here is that they cross over. So in terms of thinking about the emerging schooling of the future, I think there is a big push to say that there's an integration here of competencies that you would think of as being more about how people work with competencies that you might have applied in the past to more academic or content areas. These 5 that you see here are all from the Schools for the Future program, or schools which is in Detroit and Connecticut, and hopefully coming to Massachusetts. So continuing to move down. So criteria for selecting competencies. First of all, in my opinion, less is more. If you have a program that is simply saying here are 5,000 standards, and those are our competencies, I would say that that's not a competency-based program, it's a standards-based program. Nothing wrong with that, and that's a choice that people might want to make, but it's not a competency-based program. Secondly, competencies are meant to cut across prioritized standards, meaning that for competency-based to work where students are advancing flexibly, in my opinion, you can't simply use every standard as is, but you have to make some decisions and say that, you know, of these 1,000 standards, we're going to really concentrate on 250 of them, not ignoring the others, but simply saying that these 250 connect to the others in really powerful ways. And then you have a really powerful interaction that can take place between your prioritized standards, which are less than 1,000, and your competencies, which might be something like 10 or 15. And a litmus test that you would then have is, do your competencies on the bottom add clarity for the students and the teachers as they are teaching what they're teaching based on their prioritized standards? And I think, you know, I ran into a couple of situations where teachers said, oh man, I can't teach all of these standards, and on top of that, the competencies. So that's kind of missing the point here, which is that the competencies are meant to add clarity to the standards and to help teachers and students alike understand what's important and what's not as important. So that, I would say, is a really key test as you're moving forward. So any chats about that? Any questions? Because this is really kind of over here in some ways the core, the nut of the important distinction, or how a competency-based program might think about advancing. Any questions about that? Okay, hearing none or seeing none, I'm going to move on here and say the case for competency-based education is these 3 points. If done well, a whole lot more ownership and engagement by students. Secondly, teaching and learning has to be tailored to real student data, so like it or not, you're going to have a classroom in a school where data is flowing all the time in terms of how students are doing. And data, by the way, doesn't have to be and isn't necessarily a test. It can be how students are doing on any particular assignment in real time. And finally, this balance between the content/standards and higher order thinking, which are also, by the way, needed for college and career readiness. That last piece about CCR, I'm going to come back to again later on. So, if this is as good as motherhood, cherry pie, and patriotism, why isn't everybody doing it? What makes it hard? What are the challenges? So we're now going to kind of shift into that and take a deeper look. So I've talked a lot about the flexibility of time. What does it look like? And what it is not. So first of all, it's not, in terms of making time flexible, covering everything. Because a coverage, which would be more of the traditional approach, would simply mean that you're going in a linear fashion, but rather this is about students being able to demonstrate that they got it. So at a certain point, a student might say, you know, Miss or Mr., you know, can I take the final test, or can I do the final? I don't need to do all of these smaller things at this point. I got it. And the answer from the teacher might be, okay, give it a shot. You know, maybe you do, and let's just be cognizant of the fact that if it's not, nothing lost. We'll come back and we'll circle back and do some of these other points. And it's also not about students just getting by with a D. So I'm seeing now a chat, which I'm going to respond to from, I think, Mike. Let me pull this up over here. Actually, Suzette first. Mike, this all would be hard to manage before tech. Absolutely not impossible, because it was done before tech, but much, much harder. And I'll talk later on about why, but I think you can imagine that the technology age has made all of this a lot more doable. And Suzette is asking a question in a math situation. Do you think a teacher needs to become proficient in certain skills before they can demonstrate his I would say that they both happen at the same time, which is also a great question. So in the past, and I think a lot of this has been kind of brought to the fore by NCTM, the idea used to be in some places that, well, until students knew their basic skills like decimals, fractions, multiplications, they couldn't deal with competencies. But in fact, competencies help bring alive the basic skills and all the skills, whether it's simple or complex. Therefore, you can teach big ideas and complex competencies or competencies initially, and that can help students demonstrate, in fact, that they know how to multiply fractions or to do proportions. So I say it's not layered, but in fact it happens at the same time. So moving on, still on element 1 about flexibility of time. An advancement system, how could this look in a real life situation? So this is Schools for the Future. We have 4 performance levels, and in each one of the areas from Core 1 to Pathways, we would group a certain number of standards, and those would be addressed primarily in each one of the areas from Core 1 all the way up to Pathways, but the competencies would be applied similarly across all of the areas. So the same competencies in Core 1 could be applied in Pathways or Transitions. They're simply more complex standards. Something else to kind of understand here, and this gets to the idea of the differences in the disciplines. You could have a student working on competency or on standards in Core 1 in math, but standards in ELA and transitions. So a student isn't necessarily in transitions or Core 1 solely. They might be doing some work in 2 or 3 at the same time, but at a certain point, okay, 95% of your work now is completed in Core 2. You're ready to demonstrate to us that you're ready to go into transitions by making some type of a major presentation. So while we're not saying that students are strictly one or the other, there is a point where we do move students on. This does get into the issue of, oh my God, do we have 500 different schedules for 500 different students? And the answer is yes and no. So we would have schedules which are built so that students are each having different schedules, but at the same time, it's not as if there are 500 different schedules, because some things remain largely the same for all students. But tinkering around the edges, and for some students around the core, there are some major differences between schedules for some students versus others. But I'll show how this actually works as we move on. But the purpose of this graphic is simply to show that in a competency-based system such as Schools for the Future, we use a flex and module schedule to be able to put this together. So if you look down at a week in the life of a student here, what stays the same? Well, all students are in advisory, and we have typically 15 students in an advisory. I'm going to point to that up here, and that stays the same. All students have that. All students have lunch. All students have the PAC, which is an extension, in fact, of the advisory in some ways. Students are together in the Learning Center, but they're doing different things. We lump students together into workshops, which are over here. Here's a 10-week grammar booster. We would have students that stay together for those 10 weeks because we know that there is work that needs to be done for that period of time. We might have a reading intervention that lasts the entire year or 6 months. And on the other hand, we might have an activity here in a workshop for ELA, which is only focusing on a particular standard or competency because students are really weak in that and need help. All of these pieces can be added to and subtracted to, which might sound complicated, but it's actually fairly simple in terms of doing it, that we might have this schedule stays intact for 2 or 3 weeks, and then we decide in the school to add and subtract some time to it later on. So or flex schedule can be changed as we move forward. And moving down. So why is this so hard to do? And it might seem obvious that it's hard to do just as we haven't done it in the past and it takes some practice. But the main reason that it's hard is that because of the culture issue, which is that for those of us that grew up in a non-competency-based or non-personalized world, the reality is that we know what we know. So this takes a lot of training and a lot of repetition and a lot of culture building because it's not something that we know. So in terms of alignment, there is a big disconnect still between the way reporting systems happen for traditional systems, such as the end of the year, everybody gets a grade at the same time, versus competency-based systems when students might get grades at all different times. And lastly, and in the world of EdTech, the certified learning tools. In my opinion, you need to find some proprietary tools to be able to use, certainly at the beginning to get started, but yet the search for quality tools that can provide either all subjects, a course catalog, or just a couple of subjects one by one. The quality is very, very scattered. So I'm seeing a question now from Lisa. What learning management systems do CBE use? It's all over the place. Everything from Canvas is one tool which is popular. There is a whole list of different assets that people use, and if you'd like, I can share that with you afterwards in terms of some that have been vetted. But essentially, it's all over the place, and there's a lot of experimentation in the field. What folks say about Canvas that they like is that the developer is not huge and will work with them in terms of being able to customize it to their needs. PowerSchool is certainly not an LMS, but a student information system, which is out there and has been used, but there's lots and lots of different tools. And if you'd like, I can certainly send a list of those that are pretty popular at this point. Let me look up and see if we have anything else. Nope. So let me move down then. So moving into essential element number 2, real-time data. You can see the list over here of the types of data that you might be looking at. Formative assessments are key because that would be based on what teachers are doing every day in the classroom or in a learning center. What are they seeing? It doesn't test. It can simply be feedback from the student in terms of how they are progressing small writing sample in real time. Assessments need to be meaningful based on competency attainment, pegged to college and career readiness standards. This is pretty key that for competency-based programs, you really want to ask the question, at the end of the student's experience, what do they want to be able to do and demonstrate to be able to graduate from my program? For Schools for the Future, we've to college and career readiness standards, including a 21 on the ACT, which is obviously a standardized test, but you could also do assessments such as a student would need to write a research paper, which would be at an acceptable college level. So you about what is your final goal here. Transparency for students, parents, and staff, it's pretty critical that this be a driving principle of a competency-based program is that if you go into a competency-based school, you should be able to pull a student aside at any point and say, can you explain to me where you are in your journey? And a student should be able to take out their portfolio or their individual learning plan or whatever and be able to explain to you, here's where I am. Here's where I am in math, here's where I am in ELA, here's where I am in my trajectory. So transparency is key. And here's an example now of a math rubric, and I'm trying to now drill a little deeper so you can see some examples. This is from Diploma Plus. This is math. On the top, you see a Diploma Plus competency, which I talked about before, communicate mathematical ideas. That is applied against the state standard, so linear equations on the bottom. And across the horizontal are merging, which is the lowest level, or actually absence of evidence of where a student is, to advance at the top. And most competency-based programs, oops, let me go back. Most competency-based programs are using 4 proficiency as the base level. So below that, including capable and bridging, which is transitioning towards proficiency, would be you're still working on it, and that's fine. And this could be what programs would call either an incomplete at that point, or it might be a C or even a D at this point, which I would not encourage, but it could be, but that's not, that's a grade which is moving towards proficiency at a 4, but you can also do better than proficiency. You can do advanced, which would be you got it, but you have some applied abilities here. And if you look at the wording here, this is climbing the ladder of more complexity over time. So everything from understanding at the beginning to at the top, application, creation, analysis, that type of thing. So any questions about that and how this rubric would be applied? And this could be used in the classroom for any type of mathematical activity, from a simple experiment to something very, very complex. Okay, moving down, keeping us moving.
Ephraim, I do have a question.
Yes.
In terms of the competencies, since they are able to be used for all the math ones, I see that was the math competency 5. How many math competencies would you have compared to how many math standards there are?
Well, for Diploma Plus, I think that they have roughly 10 math standards that are used for, I'm sorry, math competencies, and maybe it's even less. It could be 8 or 9, and those are applied against, if it's a state, all of the state math competencies, or for the Common Core, the same thing. So you're talking about literally dozens and dozens and dozens of standards of being used against just a handful of competencies.
And Jan has a comment in the chat too.
I think you just answered mine.
Okay, great. Let me just look at that and make sure. So each competency would have a list of standards. Yeah, I mean, typically the way you would do this would be you would lay out, you know, all of the standards, particularly your prioritized standards for a student's trajectory from, if you want to do it from grade 9 through 12, if we're talking about high school, or 7 through 12, and say here's in each grade or each performance level where we're going to really hit each of these standards in a big way, knowing that your competencies in each of the subjects are going to be applied against all of those, the 7th grade standards as well as the 12th grade standards.
So you're really developing a scaffold.
Yes.
With the standards to it.
You're developing a scaffold. The standards are being scaffolded higher and higher as they become more and more complex, and you're using the competencies to be able to continue to come back to those standards and say, okay, we asked you to do some modeling of the simple mathematical content. Now we're asking you to do some modeling of this much more complex mathematical concept or idea, and can you do it? So there's a scaffolding, a continuing to come back to it to make sure that students just don't get it once, but they can do it 3, 4, 5 times.
Okay.
So number 2, moving us on, why is Essential 2 so hard? Again, which is this whole idea of using data and moving students along with mastery. So new role for teachers. It's not something that teachers who have been teaching for a long time necessarily have been taught. It's a new mindset for students. You will run into an issue, we have certainly, of students saying, this isn't real school. Real school is where the teachers tell me this is going to be on the test, or where I'm giving a worksheet, or where things are very, very routinized. Third, that you have to have a very usable data system in place. Before about a learning management system also applies to the data system. What's in place that teachers can use and students could use in real time? And lastly, and this is really key, unless you have a schedule where teachers and staff have enough time to plan, and I would say plan daily, it's not going to work, because this is no longer where a teacher plans over the summer and then delivers in September through June. There's a lot of flexibility, a lot of changing, a lot of analysis, and unless students and teachers have the time, teachers especially, to be able to plan together, it's not going to work. So, what's implied by CBE, which is relevant to what we're going to talk about in terms of element 3, which is the last? There's this whole area which we started out at the beginning with talking about, which is not exactly academics, but we also don't want to talk about it or think about it as something which is separate. It encompasses a lot of these ideas: social emotional learning, connecting to student interests, building school culture where there's some expectation which is shared, and strong student-staff working relationships. So let's dig into that a little bit over here and look at one, for instance, which is Schools for the Future. We call it this on the top. 2 things: building student social emotional and also a learning management competencies. And we have two ways to deal with it, advisory and PACT. For the advisory, here are the competency areas or the things that we're asking students to be able to do. So just like a academic performance request, we have the same thing under advisory, where students are going to demonstrate to us in real time that they can lead a student-led conference, or that they can monitor their progress, or that they can create with us a weekly schedule. These are all things that they actually do, which is why we call the advisory the brain center. It's where they manage their progress. On the other side, under the PACT, we really call this the heart of the program, where students work on all of the other stuff, like who they are in the world, their leadership skills, how they work with others. I think Mike had asked about problem solving. Here it is. They need to demonstrate and do projects that are related to problem solving. All of these other things. So this whole area under a competency-based program where students are managing their progress and learning more about themselves is key. Any questions about this? And again, this is integrated not only in the advisory and the PACT, but in all of the subjects. So teachers are expected to be good at this, and this is not for someone else like the school social worker. It's meant to be a role that everybody shares a lot of these attributes for. So, how does it all work together? For a competency-based personalized program to work, you have to have a very, very strong infrastructure because there are so many moving parts. In some ways, there's a need for much more structure in a competency-based program than there is in a traditional school. The reason for that is just the complexity and the number of moving parts. But let's take a look over here and see what we might have. So here is a schemata that we use in Schools for the Future. And what you see over here would be a number of parts that move around the personalized learning area in the middle. The personalized learning area in the middle is meant to be a place where students are doing a lot of individual work monitored by staff. On the outside, you have a lot of flex time, which is added and subtracted. So you have workshops going on, you have advisories going on, you have the PACT going on, you have office hours with staff, but all of this is flexible and gets added and subtracted from the schedule as needed. You also have extended learning opportunities going on both during and after the school. This requires an awful lot of specific infrastructure, such as good learning management systems, good scheduling ability, good staff communication, a lot of very specifics that need to be attended to at all times. Here's a little metaphor, which is kind of showing that while over here on the outside, you might have lots of different types of houses, and everyone looks very different. There's also a lot of commonality. So the commonality in architecture is that generally there's a basement. Even if there's not a basement, there certainly is a spine of the house, and there's electricity and plumbing and all these other good things. In Schools for the Future, or in competency-based programs, while there are many different ways of doing it, there's not one size fits all, there are some commonalities. So you need to have a mastery-based approach, you need to have competencies, time needs to be flexible, and all those other things that I talked about. So there's a lot of variation, but there's also a lot of similarity. Which gets to this idea of a continuum. So you can, getting back to Marsha's question at the beginning, you can have a competency-based program which might look more traditional than others, and you could have a competency-based program where it's entirely project-based learning and students never sit in a classroom-like setting. So there's an awful lot to be decided as long as you are keeping your eyes on the prize, which is at a very minimum to be sure that mastery is the driver and that flexibility is always ruling. So with that said, I believe that we have come to the questions and answers, and I know that I've done too much talking, so hopefully here I can do this and we can have more of a discussion. So the floor is open.
I will jump in for a second. If anyone has any, please feel free. You know, what's happening to me is the more I listen and learn, the more questions that I have that I don't even know what they are, kind of a thing in a way, Ephraim, because this is a you know, a way bigger topic than I think any of us originally were aware of, even a few years back, where, you know, what did it mean? Did it just mean moving from one standard to the next? Obviously, it's a much bigger idea and a bigger picture. I guess one of the questions, and I see Mike has a question, oh, no, a comment, but a question I have, you know, we talked in the beginning about, you know, the length of time that these conversations have been taking place. What if a district contact you today and say, you know, this is where we'd like to go, and they have no foundation at all in anything? So they have to change the culture, they have to change the conversation, they have to change the focus. I mean, what would that roadmap look like? How long would it take them to get to a point where, you know, obviously you're never at the end of that journey, but how long would it take them to get that kind of up and running on a level that you would feel would be legit?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think that phases. So you don't have to do it all in one fell swoop. You could, you know, if you were a program that wanted to experiment with this, you could start off really by, you know, saying, well, let's focus initially, you know, on making ourselves more standards driven. So focus on standards and on using data better, and through that individualizing instruction more. That would be a very legitimate way to begin. So you could do it that way, and if that was the case, you know, certainly you could do PD over the summer, you know, I would say a week at least, with all of the staff and the administrators on making your school more standards driven and more driven by individualized data. Or you could go the route of saying we want to do the whole thing, and if that's the case, I would say probably you would want to start doing planning for the next year in the spring, and we're doing that now, for example, with Diploma Plus in New Haven, in a public high school there, and then having intensive training and work during the summertime for a launch in September. So I would say that if you're doing a full redo of the school, give yourself a number of months of planning in advance, beginning no later than the spring. If you're going to start piecemeal, which is fine, I think you can do the work during the summertime.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm seeing a question from Suzette, which relates to this. Could you talk about the teacher and administration PD needed to start a CBE program? And, you know, the good news here is that the know-how is now here in the field. A number of schools and a number of designers have done it enough times that it's not a secret and it's not experimentation. It all starts, I would say, with culture building, which might seem kind of funny that, you know, you would think about all these technical parts of the CBE program. That's not where it starts. It starts with talking about a really good student-centered culture, working with the principal and the key staff around that. And the next step would be kind of thinking about how does that translate into group teaching and learning. So this is really all more intuitive than it might seem and less technical, certainly at the beginning. And you get into, okay, well, here's a competency and here's how it works and here's the rubric and here's scheduling, but that really comes down the road.
Thank you. Suzette, did you have any follow-up to that? You're welcome to either ask it through the chat or, you know, I don't know who muted your microphone, but I think you're an organizer too, so you could actually do that. Okay, well, there is another question from Jan.
Okay, I'm just looking down over here. Suzette, Jan, we've worked on priority standards and combining standards. How would you recommend going about the development of competencies? You said 250, or you said a certain number of times. Okay, so first of all, for what I would suggest for competencies is that your starting place would be to look at competencies that other programs have come up with. There's lots and lots of work that's been done. A lot of it's been tested by or validated by different places. Diploma Plus, I believe, years ago submitted theirs to the Marzano lab. There's lots and lots of different sets of competencies, so I don't think you have to go about necessarily creating your own. I would start with looking at what other programs and models have and deciding which ones you like and maybe playing around with them. What you'll find, again, is typically a program like Diploma Plus has no more than 10 competencies per discipline, plus some personal or 21st century skill competencies, maybe a maximum of 40 or 50 total. So it's not a huge number, but I would not advise you to spend your time creating competencies, at least initially from scratch, but rather looking at what's out there already and choosing from them.
Last week we had a question about, someone asked about pointing us toward some good examples. Do you have some resources that, and I've kind of been, looking again back through iNicole, Competency Works. And there are a lot of great resources there. Find yourself spending days there. But do you have some places that you could send some of us?
Yeah, well, if what is being looked for is just like one or two examples of competencies that some different programs have been using, I could just kind of send those. Same thing about the earlier question about learning management system. I could send sort of 10 to 15 learning management systems that are popular with CBE adopters at this point. Then there's also, I do think that going on the Competency Works site and just kind of navigating through, there's an awful lot there. It can feel unyieldly, but if you kind of start off with saying, I'm just going to look for competencies, list of competencies, or I'm just going to be looking for rubrics, that can work as well. There is really so much out there in the field right now. I'm doing some work indirectly for the Carnegie Corporation and going through different sites to find tools, and there's just so much out there. It can be a little overwhelming and mind-boggling. But, one way I suppose we could address this would be, Marcia, if you would be the kind of point person and send me a list of, can you give me, 3 or 4 examples of this and 3 or 4 examples of that, I could certainly just kind of click on those links and send it to you. Or again, people could do some navigating through something like Competency Works.
Yep. Okay, that sounds great. That sounds great. So if anyone has anything that they want me to get to Ephraim, please just send it to me. Most of you who are listening now, all of you listening now, and those of you who would be on the archive version, probably also know how to contact me. You can always go to the EdTech Specialists website. This sounds great. I see that Lisa has a question for you too, Ephraim.
Okay, going down. I'm coming to it. Most student data systems aren't designed for CBE or that exists, or the ones that there are ones out there now that are made specifically for CBE data tracking, which I could also send. There's not a lot, I agree, and some of the systems, such as PowerSchool, are pretty clunky when it comes to this, but there are more and more emerging now that are.
What I will do is, based on these 3 ideas that you're saying you're going to send us information on and links to, and I'm sure there will be more, we can put that into a document that will be linked to our website so that people can go back to this competency-based education page, and we can kind of create that as a resource that is follow-up, not only kind of giving people the schedule of upcoming webinars, but also as follow-ups. So anything you can send us, we'll make sure that those of you listening, we'll make sure that we get that into some kind of a format that you can easily find.
Great, and I'm not sure if I think we may be winding down now. We're past 10 by a bit. If I wanted, I would just leave you with one thought, which is that in some ways, doing competency-based education is more intuitive than it might appear. And part of the reason that I worry about showing so many tools and talking about all the different levels of this can seem a little mind-boggling and, oh my God, there's so much here to do. The reality is that there is a lot, but it also is intuitive at a certain point, and it can be scaffolded in bit by bit in a very logical way. And so much of this is really about building a strong school culture and really emphasizing good teaching and learning.
That's a good thing to wrap things up with, Ephraim, because honestly, I having worked with districts who are, have done many innovative things, Jan Birmingham's district, for example, down in Berrien Springs, they've taken many different initiatives and many different journeys, and in the beginning, it can seem like a lot and overwhelming, but the minute you change that culture and that conversation, it does become more natural, and it's fun to watch the different ways too that people take an idea and then fine-tune it to their own demographic. You're giving us tools is what you're actually doing in my mind, and then they build around that. So I appreciate that very much. Thank you. Is there anyone who would like to add any more comments or questions before we wrap things up? I will mention for those of you listening and those of you on with us or viewing the recording, our next CBE webinar is June 23rd with Chris Sturgis. We've referenced several times this morning Competency Works, and although she's involved with many things, that's Competency Works is kind of the icon that I associate her with. It's a great resource. Chris is a wonderful resource for us as well. So June 23rd at 9 a.m. is our next webinar. I look forward to having you with us. And Ephraim, I can't thank you enough. Thank you. I mean, it's as I've shared with people, it's just so wonderful to be able to reach out to people like you. And without hesitation, you said, yes, I'd love to participate, and I appreciate that immensely. So thank you.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for your participation. Apologies for yapping so much, but as a follow-up again, I would be glad to share tools with you and answer any questions. So thanks, and have a great day.
Thank you very much.